Hello, everybody. Welcome back to That CMMC Show. We have a very special edition where we're talking about the intersection of CMMC and the new HIPAA proposed rule update.
That's right.
And I am joined by one of my absolute dearest friends, the one and only Shawn Hays. Shawn, we've gotten the privilege of working together at Summit 7 for many, many years. You left the defense space to pursue the HIPAA space of the healthcare world, which is one of the reasons we're talking today, to talk about the intersection of the two, because there's no one more versed on both topics than you, Shawn Hays, on both of these items. So I'm excited to jump in because we see a lot of overlay kind of happening in the industry, and we see a lot of people that support the DoD, especially like VA, that are going to have to potentially meet both of these controls, right? Both for the commercial side of their business and the defense side. So, Shawn, who are you?
I don't know if I can carry that mantle that you just gave me and all the monikers you just ascribed to me, but I'll try to do my best on the show. So I'm Shawn. I have worked quite a bit in the CMMC space and in the DIB space. Still dabbled a little bit of that after I left Summit 7 and went to work at Microsoft for quite some time. So when I joined Microsoft, I worked on a lot of our vertical marketing. So understanding kind of where the platform is going and how that applies to the regulatory space and all these different industries, and did a bunch of other stuff. But a lot of my time was spent on the healthcare side of things. Okay. And so it's very interesting. I'm now with a company called Varonis that is a data security platform provider, and still doing a little bit of the same stuff. And so we recently covered some things around healthcare, and you and I started to chat. And so I thought it was like a really, really interesting subject matter because there is so much overlap, both from an industrial standpoint. So what applies to some of these markets, there's a lot of overlap, and some of the requirements, that's the second overlap or second intersection. So not only are there overlap in the sense that some of the same organizations are supporting the Department of Defense, while also serving you and I, the average bear, so to speak, with healthcare provisions and with pharmaceuticals and with, making sure that I pay my bill on time, all those types of things. Some companies have overlaps in customer bases and with regulation. So I thought it would be a cool topic, and I'm glad you're having me.
I'm super excited for it because this gets brought up more than people think. I remember being on calls with people 2-3 years ago, and they're like, yeah, but we have HIPAA, it's like, we're good with CMMC or we're good with CUI because HIPAA trumps this, right? And it's like, oh, okay, well, we need to step back for just a little bit. And to the question that you just addressed too, like there's multiple industries kind of impacted that are serving both communities, right? The VA is a huge, huge part of the DoD, right? The medical care given to both retired and active duty soldiers is incredible, and we appreciate all the work they do. But there's a lot of organizations, a lot of companies that have a small piece of what they do, or maybe even a 40-50% of their revenue tied to VA work, and maybe the rest is servicing the commercial space, right? You and me, like you just mentioned, right? They're supporting the big mega chains of hospitals. They're providing billing services. Maybe they're doing, electronic medical health records, right? Things like that. And so this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Outside of the VA, are there any other that kind of come to mind that you just see maybe overlooked industries in the healthcare space that could be participating in this?
Yeah. So I want to answer that question. One thing I will say, you mentioned this, and I've heard this before too, where an organization may say, oh, well, I have CMMC, so that trumps HIPAA, or I have HIPAA, so that trumps CMMC, or like I'm good, so to speak, because I've done one or the other. Though there's a lot of truth in that, meaning like, okay, if one regulation requires me to employ MFA, well, if the other one requires MFA, well, as long as my users are authenticating via MFA, then okay, like technically, yes, there is a true overlap there, and you've done your due diligence on both sides, but it doesn't necessarily always mean that. So yeah, it's like definitely a Venn diagram. As far as like where I've seen a lot of this overlap from a regulation standpoint, like an organization that has both requirements. I've seen it with, I think you mentioned this, like academic health institutions that are rather doing maybe like research
Yep.
for the Department of Defense, like the impacts, health studies, things of that nature, or they're doing, specific research for the military. And then they're also doing, research for academia and other means. That's a big one. So research. Also, too. Speaking of research, there's a lot of organizations that are in the research ecosystem. So I'll give you an example of this. They provide bio samples. There's a company here in actually Huntsville, Alabama, that does this type of work where you're providing bio samples for research. Anything that's going into the actual like just the research supply chain in the medical industry. Whether you're providing samples to commercial research organizations or academic institutions or whatever. A lot of those organizations, also to like blood and plasma, with all these providers that are providing just like blood and plasma. Sorry, there's no other eloquent way of putting that.
Blood,
The
plasma, those
hospitals.
things.
Yeah. So like they have, contracts with VA hospitals and with the Department of Defense and all that kind of good to supply regular allotments of blood and plasma, much as they do, with local banks and stuff here, like in Huntsville or your metropolitan area, or with whatever hospital system you have in your area. So anyway, and then another interesting thing too that I've seen this pop up more and more is through business agreements that you have. So like your like business associate agreements that you have, kind of like how in the DIB space you have like contractors and subcontractors, and then there's kind of like flow down of requirements. A lot of times too, there are organizations that supply goods and services to a healthcare provider or a healthcare system. And so ipso facto, they're starting to, we'll get into it a little bit, but like there's kind of like some flow down stuff that's in the notice of proposed rulemaking for HIPAA and the security rule. So that's going to become even more of an overlap where you once thought, oh, well, I'm the sub, I my prime kind of handles things, so to speak. That is going to start to get a little dispelled over time, because now there's going to be requirements for those that hold a BAA or a business associate agreement. Like those business associates are going to have to start providing like justification documentation that they're also doing what they're supposed to do. So,
Have a good
sorry,
down.
long-winded answer, but those are all the areas where I'm kind of seeing like a little bit of overlap and things pop up like that.
So one interesting thing, kind of as an additional overlap here, is cloud providers, right? Now, HIPAA, at least to my recollection, doesn't have FedRAMP requirements and things like that. However, CMMC does for controlled and classified information, with certain military personnel records could easily fall into, right? And so when we're looking at this kind of interesting thing, even at a cloud provider level, like it could be that you're doing HIPAA, right, in commercial clouds today. You're being able to meet it and check the box. However, if those records are also CUI, now you have to be storing that in FedRAMP moderate clouds. Well, I was talking to a company the other day, and like Epic and Cerner and like the big boys, right, in that space.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things is, the last time I checked, there are no FedRAMP clouds having that data. And so now you're even limiting the ability of what you can actually do. And so when you start going through this exercise of mapping the two together, you realize one might have a little bit more of a strength here, and then there's a deficiency here, right? Kind of back and forth, back and forth. So
can I hit on that actually real quick?
Stuff. Yeah, please do.
Quick little like 30 seconds. Funny you bring that up. So during my Microsoft time, one of the things that we worked on, and this is like in the public domain, public space, so none of this is like super secret sauce or anything, but one of the big things was working with Epic to host Epic, which historically has been kind of like an on-prem thing. So you stand up the big server farm and do all that stuff, and that's your health record system. Typically it sits, on-prem or private cloud, whatever. But they were allowing Microsoft to start hosting Epic on Azure. And so that's still like technically a thing today. You can go search that. I think there's like even like architecture that's out there, but also too like services where Microsoft can kind of help you walk through what that looks like. But you can now host Epic on Azure, and it's like a known, sanctioned, approved thing from Epic. And one thing that I do not fully know, but it would be a good like research follow-up thing, is can you host Epic on Azure and in Azure Government? And I believe the answer is yes. Like there's
I
no
would just, yeah, that makes sense why.
fundamental, reason why you couldn't or shouldn't.
Well, and
So
Azure Commercial meets the basic CUI requirements, which a lot of these records would fall under anyways.
right.
The the gotcha there is, okay, so I have this data center I can now host the application on for my organization.
Yep.
It, are you trying to turn that into a kind of a more SaaS-based tool for multiple other agencies, the DoD, to use? And the question is, when do you move from the 110 controls because you're self-hosting on a FedRAMP cloud for that application? And
Mhm.
depending on the service you're trying to provide with that system, could you drift over to actually having to have the application FedRAMP even though you're hosting it privately? So, to your point, Shawn, like the ability to privately host it is incredible because right now that's the only workaround that people supporting, like the VA, for example, if they're hosting applications like that, can do. Because you look at the FedRAMP marketplace, I just don't see them there. And if they are there, please let us know in the comments because that would be a huge win, especially for a lot of federal agencies there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
one of the questions I have to ask, because we've kind of gone down this path just a little bit. So HIPAA in January said, "Hey guys, we're gonna kind of have to do something more than we've been doing for what, a decade plus at this point. We're going to
Mhm.
introduce some new requirements, or maybe just updates to existing requirements." How how does that actually fit? Like, what are some of the new things?
Yeah.
What has HIPAA seen has like not been a good call over the past 10 plus years, and they're kind of pivoting to more maybe heavy-handed regulation here. What have you seen from like your general pass through of the new proposed rule there?
Yeah. So there's a ton of overlap if you think back to like 2000 and maybe like 18 time frame. I think
Okay.
back to when the MITRE papers came out.
Yep.
Bob Metzger, kind of the stalwarts of the DIB space and of
We love you,
CMMC.
Bob.
Yeah, shout out to Bob. When the papers came out that through MITRE about kind of the state of affairs within the defense industrial base. If you look at this notice of proposed rulemaking for the HIPAA security rule, it's almost copy paste. They obviously didn't do
Absolutely.
that. I'm not accusing,
Sure.
but it's so much copy and paste of. In fact, I have it in front of me. I'm going to read like a couple of
Oh
quotes.
boy. Spicy meatball.
Yeah, it's just I have to just read it verbatim. So, despite the long-standing nature of the security rule, the HIPAA security rule, and the proliferation of guidance documents from NIST, so NIST 866, things like that, the department, CISA, FTC, and others, regulated entities continue to fail to implement reasonable and appropriate security measures as required by the security rule. So
Oh
like
my
literally
gosh.
everything I said, like you could just replace security rule with, DFAR 7012 and some of the CMMC language that first came out. Like, I mean, like literally implement reasonable and appropriate security measures as required by DFAR 7012. Like that's basically what, if you look back at the MITRE papers, like that's kind of what it was. Is hey, we're finding time and time again, whether it be through reporting, through the Department of Health and Human Services,
Mhm.
HHS's OCR requirements. And when you have a breach over a certain threshold that affects a certain amount of records, like you got to report it. And so then they go and investigate some of those. There's also like OCR does regular like periodic audits of entities, and they do like a certain amount a month because they only have so many people, and
Sure.
they've lost people this year. So like 50 covered entities I think were done in 2024 maybe. So they like
Wow,
audited 50
that's
companies.
not that many, by the
Not a
way.
ton.
There's a lot
It's
of
not.
healthcare providers out there.
Yeah, yeah. And those are the periodic audits. So those aren't the ones that were also triggered by breaches. So
Ah,
whenever breaches are reported, then they also, typically dive into some of those, especially if they're sizable or they're noticing a trend. So then they want to dig into a trend. So maybe they can put out some sort of, CVE or some sort of like, documentation about a known threat vector and, something going on that's ubiquitous across the industry. So
sure.
they'll do like additional ones on top of that. In 2016, though, they did like 166 or so,
Okay.
and did like a full blown analysis. Um, all that's a tangent, but basically that, this is years and years. So maybe it was 50 in 2024, but then, over time, and they never do the same one, typically back to back. So you're talking like 51 year, 100 the year before that. And in culmination for the last decade, they've found that organizations by and large are not implementing to the fullest. And some of the changes too, not only they have so many different like quotes in there about how they're noticing that organizations are not, basically applying the measures.
Mm-hmm.
Also, they have had court filings. So whenever they have a breach, there's, possible, there are penalties associated with this. And so those penalties are adjudicated, basically through the court system. And so when they're adjudicated, and so they just, discern, okay, this company needs to be fined XYZ amount. In that process, there's litigation. And so they have a defense. And so in some of these instances, the companies have gotten around whatever the accusations were by pointing to HIPAA and the security role, and certain things were addressable. And through the litigation process, they've been able to defend themselves and say, essentially, this was optional. We didn't think it was addressable. So why are you holding me, slapping me on the wrist? Because this wasn't.
I'm just putting your words back at you, right? It's like, you guys didn't make it. Like, it's very soft is what the old HIPAA seems to have been. Like, a lot of kind of soft, you can do it, you should do it, it's applicable, but you could justify your way out of it. So it doesn't sound like, funny enough, the new HIPAA sounds like it's just catching up to DFAR 7012. It doesn't actually sound like it's like catching up to CMMC from any level of like a independent certification, right?
We're not there yet.
Sounds like we're just like, okay, guys, we're serious now. You have to do everything in the list. You can't like pick and choose. And if you can't implement one of them, you have to have a really strong position on why you can't, to, maybe it breaks technology. Like, they have the Office of Civil Rights inside of HHS, which is the DIBCAC equivalent, right? So they're doing kind of random assessments, or they're breaches and things like that, where they're coming and assessing your compliance. So it sounds like they're really just kind of catching up to DFAR 7012, which the DoD's been rocking, supposedly in full effect December 31st of 2017, which we all know that has not happened. So it's kind of interesting to kind of look at what all that actually, the updates, I guess, to it, because a lot of it's encryption based, a lot of it is authorization access based, right? They didn't exactly add a bunch of extra requirements. They just said you have to do all these requirements now, and there's not the equivalent of a POAM, right? They used to kind of have this POAM concept in HIPAA, similar to DFAR 7012, right? And a lot of people were just using POAMs as scapegoats for not implementing things at all. Again, coming back to the CMMC requirement nowadays for the DoD. So again, what's your kind of take on that? Are there other things that HIPAA that you're seeing in the proposed rule that they're catching up to DFAR 7012? Or is there anything more closer in alignment with CMMC that has maybe more severity to the requirements or third-party certifications? There's nothing like that in there, is there?
Yeah. How much time do we have left?
we've got a whopping 30 minutes to talk as much as we want to talk.
Okay. One thing, anecdotally, I wanted to go back to one of the things you said too about, like when we were talking about like OCR and why there'd be an audit, that kind of thing. So they do periodic audits, like we were talking about, breaches that can cause an audit. One other thing too is, this is an overlap comment that I wanted to bring up. Another way that an audit can happen, it's kind of like FCA's, like the False Claims Act. So like if, there's like a whistleblower situation, technically can be complaints that are filed with OCR that it's like, hey, like my organization's not doing what they're supposed to do. And in fact, here's some instances, where this happened. They have similar stuff where basically you can kind of do the whistleblowing situation with FCA.
Very interesting. So again, it's basically copy and paste DFAR 7012, right? It's like, you know, and then CMMC, the MITRE report, which is basically word for word what's in the proposed rule for HIPAA, it's like, hey, nobody was been doing this. Like the data is at high risk, and we've got to be a little bit more heavy-handed. In my opinion, after perusing the new proposed rule for HIPAA, they didn't go hard enough in the paint. They still gave a little bit more flexibility because, and correct me if I'm wrong, these organizations still get to draft their own report card, right? Unless they're randomly audited by OCR. Like, they get to give themselves an A plus, A minus, and unless they're caught not doing it, there's really no certifying third party body as part of HIPAA yet.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of the self-attestation that you're kind of alluding to. I don't think they use that exact language in the thing. So, but yeah, so they're changing things from adjustable to required. They are adding a huge amount, not a huge amount. They're adding an emphasis on documentation. So there's a lot more language if you look at the notice. If you looked at the proposed rule, it's a lot of documentation. So we talked about like the POAM going away, to some degree, they haven't had, it depends on who you talk to, how you discern the last security rule, but it wasn't very explicit that you needed to have all these things that traditionally you would assume would be in a company's SSP, their system security. Like a complete mapping of the environment, changes in the environment, documenting those changes. There's like, I want to say, let's see, I think I have notes here. Yeah, on the documentation side. Yeah, so you have to have like security policies and procedures, something you would have in an SSP. You have to have incident response policies and procedures, something you have in an SSP. Training and awareness program. In fact, that's actually like a NIST standard 171, like, category with training and awareness. So you have to have documentation of those, documentation of all the incidents that have happened in your environment and the mitigations you took, which is kind of POAMy, right? Like if you have, something occurs and you realize like, oh, we left a port open, or we realized, oh, this subset of users didn't have MFA enabled, so then we did it. Or we realized, oh, we didn't have like some sort of data loss prevention capability on this system, but we did on everything else. And so EPHI was able to be exfiltrated in some way. So we're going to mitigate it by doing XYZ. Like that's kind of POAMy stuff. And those are now explicit documentation requirements in this. So it's like catching up to your point earlier. I think your initial question was, how else is it catching up? That's one way. Another way, so that's documentation. Catching up to DFAR 7012. The other thing too is some of the things that they changed from addressable, which again was kind of argued as or seen as optional by a lot of organizations. Some of the things that they have flipped to required are things like encryption. So that is catching up a little bit to DFAR 7012, which there are some other regulations.
We are in year 2025. We're just now making that mandatory. That's a little concerning for my medical records. I'm going to be honest at this point.
Yeah. EPHI, officially, your health records have to be encrypted. So that, assuming the proposed rule goes into effect.
Man.
So encryption's now a thing. Now, granted, you have to use like FIPS validated cryptography when you authenticate into like official like health systems and stuff. So that's like an aside, but the actual EPHI, the data itself, has to be encrypted if the proposed rule and everything goes into effect. But there was like, how many comments? I think we talked about this earlier. How many comments were on the notice?
4,000 or something like that.
Oh man, we should, if we have time at the end, we need to talk about like any of the findings from those comments. I have yet to surf through them. I looked through some of them when it was in the hundreds, maybe like sub 1,000. I sifted through some of them, but that was a while ago.
I can just imagine the playback after talking to Jacob Horn for so many years, and the playback is, it's too expensive, it's too burdensome. Compliance doesn't equal security, a classic, right? At least in the rulemaking piece. How dare they regulate us in this space? And it's like, what do you mean, how dare they? Like, you haven't been doing the job. It's like the government, well, I'll say this. The government shouldn't want to have to force regulations just for fun, right? It might feel like that to some industries, but there are certain things like defense data, like, controlled and classified information. There's electronic medical records that are also sensitive for the layman, you could say. It's like there has to be some level of oversight there, because people left to their own devices, and I can tell you this just on the DoD, defense contractor side, they care about the bottom line because they're a business. Security comes second. Even if it comes second, it might come 10th or 15th or 20th in the list for a lot of organizations. But if it impacts the ability to make money, that's when it hits. And that's why something like CMMC is so interesting, because it's going to impact their ability to make money, right? Which is why I think it's so impactful to the industry, and it's going to weed a lot of people out. I mean, I'm hoping HIPAA gets to the point eventually where they're more heavy-handed, right? They have third-party auditors, and maybe even the healthcare industry or complex ends up consolidating some to providers that can actually protect the data. Because it's scary out there how many defense contractors haven't been protecting the data for years. And I'm sure, based on the findings for OCR and things, I'm sure they're finding very similar things, that, hey, nobody actually did this, like optional,
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, you hitting on that, like the burdensome part of it. I think a silver lining, and this, I'm like preaching to the choir here, but like a silver lining to the how onerous it is and expensive, all those types of things, and talking about the burden. The reason we're doing this talk is so for organizations that do healthcare stuff, healthcare related things, and then also do things in the defense industrial base. The investment you make in a labeling technology that's going to like label a file and encrypt it, that same capability that you bought, is you can create policies and use that and pivot without buying a new tool. You can literally just pivot and use that same labeling and encryption technology on PHI. You can take your IDP, your identity provider that is allowing multi-factor authentication. Maybe you're using Microsoft Entra ID. That multi-factor authentication that you're using over there can meet the requirement over here. Yeah. And like what I was saying too, you can add backup. So, let's say you invest in a backup solution like Halfpoint. So you have backup that you're backing up CUI in those systems. Well, you could pivot that solution and start backing up.
Document it for HIPAA.
For HIPAA. And so anyway, it's just like a lot of those investments. I think another thing too, that I've seen happening in the defense industrial base that I think you will see happen if some of this stuff happens with if the proposed rule making stuff lands and sticks after the comment period. They added a ton. They added like 6 new audit and analysis kind of requirements that even have timestamps. So you have to do them annually or every 6 months or, something to that effect.
Kind of sounds Spursy to me a little bit on the DoD side.
Yeah.
Got to do an annual
exactly.
assessment.
Yeah, exactly. And so I could see there being a situation where, you invest in an MSSP, or you have some sort of external party that's helping you put together documentation, or helping you do a compliance audit every 12 months, or helping you review and test all your technical controls every 12 months. That was another one. So, and they can help you document how they've, tested those technical controls. Sorry, I'm getting a little laggy there. But anyway, I think some of the same investments that you make, even in, a managed security service provider that you're using, I think some of those can even help with the kind of burdensome audit and analysis requirements that are being added. A lot of organizations have kind of raised their eyebrows at pen testing every 12 months, because, a pen testing company to come in and do pen testing, that can be a little bit expensive. Vulnerability scanning every 6 months. That's another one that, some folks have said, oh man, that's like to do, continuous vulnerability assessments like that, maybe too onerous. But by and large, like I'm saying, some of the stuff's already in your CMMC requirements, that you do regular assessments, regular audits. And so those same investments, both on a technology as well as the like the people process stuff that you implement, there's a lot of overlap.
So what's interesting, because if I were to give anybody any advice around both the HIPAA and the CMMC, first look at the highest watermark. So the highest watermark of the data you have to protect, NIST 800-171, right? Because if it's CUI is your top line. So you have to use FedRAMP clouds, right? So when you're making implementation, similar to what Shawn was saying around Intra ID or AvPoint backup services or you name it, if it's going to have CUI as the higher of the two baselines for what you're protecting, make sure that you're already making a jump to the compliant cloud providers that can support that. So then, to Shawn's point, when you implement those controls that have overlap with both HIPAA and CMMC requirements, you're already covered 2 thumbs up, right, on both sides of the fence. And then, then you kind of go down the list and see where there's any gaps between HIPAA and CMMC, right? Like pen testing as a hard and fast requirement for HIPAA, right? It's got to happen. And then you add those layers on top of it. Now, to your point, Shawn, with MSPs and MSSPs, one of the things that CMMC requires is a customer responsibility matrix or a shared responsibility. You might have heard it called before. For HIPAA, this would be a really good thing just to proactively ask for. Hey, service provider, how are you helping me meet these requirements? Because I have to have these documented in my system, but I'm using an outsourced service like yourselves, right? So blending kind of that shared responsibility matrix in with both CMMC requirements and HIPAA overlay to have people be able to answer those questions if they can provide support for both of those simultaneously. One kind of last question I think it's worth addressing is the supply chain piece, right? So we know with DFAR 7012, where the data goes, so does the protection requirement down the supply chain. We know with CMMC, there's even kind of a additional level of requirements where the prime has to possess, the information or not even necessarily the certification, but validation that the subcontractors are meeting the requirement. It's called out by the contract. And that's kind of a cool thing with HIPAA now, right? Where HIPAA now is requiring the BAA, kind of their flow down for subcontractors, suppliers, so forth and so on, that the prime, you could say in this relationship, have to also hold evidence to attest to their supply chain being compliant. So I think that's one really, really kind of cool overlap is that people are seeing it's not only the primary awardee of the work, right? Whether that's commercial or whether that's, defense or federal contracts, it's the people all supporting that also need to be held accountable. And the quote unquote prime in this case needs to be able to have good records that they're sending this to organizations that are protecting the data appropriately, which is also good both for my medical records and for controlled unclassified information. And with that, Shawn, final words and recommendations. I just want to, anything you want to throw out there, 3 Hail Marys, whatever it is.
Yeah, one last thing that we haven't talked about in full maybe is AI. So I think a lot of organizations are also looking at ways to protect their AI solutions that they're deploying. Maybe it's Copilot. And so I think there's a lot of overlap there too as well. So the same type of measures you're going to safeguard the use of AI and secure AI systems. A lot of those that, if you're handling controlled unclassified information, you're handling systems, AI is tapped into those systems. I think the same measures that you're taking to possibly deploy AI within your defense industrial base part of your business, I think some of those same measures are going to be effective within the new security rule for HIPAA. So that's just like my last
really
little tangent
calling
card there.
God bless the AI.
Yeah.
So, Shawn, thank you for joining us. It was very, very informative. I think a lot of industries that have overlap in both are going to find this valuable. And once the proposed rule moves to a final rule, which we'll see how long that takes, we'll probably get an updated conversation to bring into more alignment the HIPAA requirements with what will hopefully be not only the 32 CFR for CMMC, but the 48 CFR as well being finalized, and have a little update here. So, Shawn, my dear friend, thanks for joining, and thanks everybody for listening. Have a good one.
Yeah, sorry for being shaky Shawn near the end, a little glitchy there, but we made it.
We made it. Have a good one, guys.